You're in my light, old man. Move. Or better yet, why don't you just go home? Why don't you just go home?
Why don't you just go home? The words cut through the humming fluorescence of the 43rd floor like a blade through silk. Silas Thorne didn't look up from the stack of mail he was sorting. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, continued their steady rhythm. Envelope, scan, stack. Envelope, scan, stack. What Silas heard next was not the usual office chatter. It was the sound of 30 years of corporate cruelty compressed into a single satisfied exhale, the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. "I said move. This isn't a retirement home. You're taking up space that actual employees need." The floor fell silent. 23 junior associates, 12 senior analysts, and 4 department heads watched as Pierce Langford, HR director of Apex Strategic Holdings, stood over the elderly intern's desk with his arms crossed and his smile sharp as a paper cut. He nudged the mail cart with the toe of his Italian leather shoe. The cart wobbled. A single envelope slid off and landed face down on the polished concrete floor. Silas Thorne did not argue. He did not explain. He did not even sigh. He simply bent down, slowly because his knees were not what they used to be, and picked up the envelope. He placed it back on the cart. Then he looked up at Pierce Langford with eyes that held no anger, no fear, and no submission. Just a calm so deep it was almost unsettling. No one knew that the mail cart Pierce Langford had just kicked was purchased with money from a trust that could buy the entire building. No one knew that the elderly man sorting interoffice correspondence could end Pierce Langford's career with a single text. And no one knew that Silas Thorne was not an intern at all. He was the founder of the company Pierce Langford thought he ran. So who was Silas Thorne really? And what happened when the HR director discovered that the man he'd been mocking for 6 weeks was the reason the building existed in the first place? If you are liking this story, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. The truth of Silas Thorne was a thing built in silence, layer upon layer, like sediment becoming stone. 68 years ago, he had been born in a one-room apartment above a laundromat in Oakland's Chinatown. His mother took in mending. His father washed dishes at a hotel that wouldn't have let him through the front door. Silas had learned fractions by calculating tips his father would never receive, and he had learned English by reading discarded newspapers in the back of the laundry, pressing his small finger to words he couldn't yet pronounce. Opportunity, enterprise, ownership, words that felt like doors. He had founded Apex Strategic Holdings 41 years ago with $600 saved from 3 years of loading trucks on the overnight shift. The company had started as a 2-person logistics consultancy, operating out of a rented storage unit in Richmond. Silas had been the consultant, the accountant, the janitor, and the receptionist. He had worn a tie borrowed from his uncle to every meeting, the same tie, for 4 years, until a client finally noticed the frayed edge and said nothing, because by then Silas Thorne's reputation had already outgrown his wardrobe. By 65, Silas Thorne had built Apex into a multinational holding company with 14 subsidiaries, 8,000 employees, and annual revenues exceeding $4 billion. He had been profiled in Forbes, invited to the White House, and given the keynote address at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He had created more millionaires than he could count, executives, early employees, the janitorial contractor he'd insisted on bringing in-house with full benefits, because a building is only as strong as the people who keep it clean. And yet, at 66, Silas Thorne had stepped down as CEO, not because he was tired, though he was, not because he was sick, though his doctor had mentioned the word hypertension with the careful weight doctors use when they want you to hear thunder in a whisper. He stepped down because his wife of 44 years, May, had looked at him across the breakfast table one morning and said, "You've given the world enough, Silas. Now give yourself to us." So he did. He transferred operational control to a hand-picked board of directors. He kept his shares, his title as chairman emeritus, and an office on the 47th floor that he visited exactly twice a year for board meetings. He spent his days with May, with his garden, with the stack of books he'd been promising himself he'd read since 1987. Then May died, and the silence of the house became unbearable. It was his daughter, Elena, who suggested the internship program. Not for him, for her son. Silas's grandson, Jonah Thorne, was 23 years old, fresh out of Stanford's MBA program, brilliant and quiet, and possessed of a moral compass so precise it sometimes made Silas want to weep with pride. Jonah had applied to Apex's competitive junior associate program under his own name, his own credentials, with no mention of his grandfather's identity. He had been rejected. Twice. "They said I didn't have the right cultural fit," Jonah had told Silas over dinner, his voice steady but his hands tight around his glass. "I asked what that meant, and they said I should consider opportunities at less demanding firms. I have a 3.9 GPA from Stanford, Grandpa. I have published research. I have letters of recommendation from 2 sitting senators. What does cultural fit even mean?" Silas knew exactly what it meant. It meant the same thing it had meant in 1957 when his father was told the hotel didn't have positions suitable for his background. It meant the same thing it had meant in 1978 when Silas's first loan application was rejected by a loan officer who didn't bother to read past the name at the top of the form. The language had become more polite. The cruelty had not changed at all. So, Silas Thorne, founder and chairman emeritus of Apex Strategic Holdings, made a decision. He would not call the CEO. He would not pull strings. He would not invoke his name. Instead, he would enter the company through the only door that seemed to be open to people who looked like him, the internship program. The irony was not lost on him. 41 years after founding the company, Silas Thorne applied for an unpaid internship in the mailroom of his own building. He used his full legal name, Silas James Thorne, which no one in the current administration thought to connect to the S.J. Thorne engraved on a plaque in the lobby. He wore a second-hand cardigan from Goodwill and carried a brown leather satchel he'd bought at a garage sale for $6. He drove himself to work every morning in a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper. And for 6 weeks he sorted mail. He pushed a cart through the corridors of his own empire. He watched, he listened, and he learned exactly what kind of company Apex had become.
It started, as these things often do, with a coffee order. Pierce Langford had been the HR director at Apex for 11 years. He was 47 years old, recently divorced, and possessed of that particular species of confidence that comes from never once being told that you are the problem. He wore suits that cost more than the monthly salary of the mailroom staff, and he walked through the office like a man who believed the floor should be grateful to bear his weight. Intern, coffee, black, 2 sugars, from the shop on the corner, not the machine. The machine tastes like regret. Silas looked up from the mail cart. It was his 3rd week. He had already learned to recognize the particular pitch of Pierce's voice, the performative condescension, the way he spoke to anyone beneath his pay grade as if they were hard of hearing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Langford," Silas said, his voice calm and unhurried. "I'm sorting the inter-office correspondence. The employee handbook states that interns in the distribution department are not required to—"
Pierce laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was the sound of a man who had learned long ago that humiliation was a more effective management tool than any incentive structure. The Employee Handbook. Did you hear that, everyone? Pierce raised his voice, addressing the open-plan office with the theatrical sweep of a man who believed he was performing for an audience that adored him. The intern is quoting the Employee Handbook to me. The 70-year-old intern who can barely push a cart is quoting the Employee Handbook to the Director of Human Resources. A few people laughed. Most did not. But no one spoke up. No one ever spoke up. Let me explain something to you, Silas. Pierce bent down, placing his hands on the mail cart, bringing his face close to Silas's. His breath smelled of expensive coffee and professional-grade mouthwash. You are an unpaid intern. You are here because someone felt sorry for you and decided to throw you a bone. You have no leverage. You have no value. You have no power. And if I decide that you're not a good fit for this company, you will be gone by lunchtime. Do you understand? Silas looked at Pierce Langford with the same expression he had once worn while negotiating a hostile takeover of a Fortune 500 company. It was an expression of absolute stillness, of patience, of a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is to show your hand too early. I understand, Silas said quietly. Good. Coffee. Black. 2 sugars. Now. Silas went. He walked the 3 blocks to the coffee shop on the corner. He bought the coffee with his own money, $12.47, which Pierce would never offer to repay. He walked back. He placed the coffee on Pierce's desk. Pierce didn't thank him. He didn't look up. This became the pattern. Every morning, Pierce would find something to criticize, something to mock, some new way to remind the elderly intern of his place. Silas's clothes were an embarrassment to the company's professional image. His pace was too slow for a fast-moving organization. His handwriting on the labels was illegible. Do they not teach penmanship at whatever community college you crawled out of? And every time, Silas absorbed it. He nodded. He apologized. He continued his work. He pushed his cart through the corridors, delivering packages and envelopes, learning the rhythms of the company, noticing who was happy and who was afraid, who was thriving and who was barely surviving. He collected data like a scientist studying a diseased organism, waiting for the moment when the pattern would become clear enough to act upon. The moment came on a Thursday afternoon in the 6th week. Jonah Thorne, Silas's grandson, had come to the office for a follow-up interview, the 3rd one, the one that was supposed to be a formality because the hiring manager had already told him the position was essentially his. Jonah had arrived early, dressed in his best suit, carrying a leather portfolio with his research proposals and references. He had checked in at the front desk, he had waited in the lobby for 45 minutes, and then Pierce Langford had walked through. Pierce had stopped when he saw Jonah. He had looked at the young man, at his Asian American features, at his last name on the visitor's badge, at the portfolio in his hands, and something cold and ugly had moved behind his eyes. "Another Thorne," Pierce had said, loud enough for the lobby to hear. "What is this, a family reunion? Are you related to the old man in the mailroom?" Jonah had frozen. He had not known his grandfather would be in the building. Silas had not told him. The secret had been Silas's alone, a private mission, a quiet investigation. "I know," Jonah had said. "I'm here for an interview, junior associate. I've already passed the first 2 rounds." Pierce had picked up Jonah's visitor's badge between 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. Thorne, Jonah. Stanford MBA. Impressive. His tone suggested the opposite.
You know, we get a lot of applicants from Stanford. Most of them understand that a company like Apex requires a certain polish, a certain presentation. Your suit, for instance, where did you get it?" Jonah's jaw had tightened. It was a gift. A gift? How charming. "Well, Jonah, I'll be sitting in on your interview today. I like to personally ensure that all our candidates meet the Apex standard. And I have to tell you," Pierce leaned in, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shot, "the standard is very, very high. Not everyone is cut out for it." The interview had lasted 12 minutes. Pierce had asked 7 questions. 4 of them had been about Jonah's background. 2 had been about his English proficiency, despite Jonah being born in San Francisco and educated entirely in the United States. The final question had been, if you were hired, how would you handle clients who might be uncomfortable working with someone of your particular demographic? Jonah had answered with grace, with precision, with the kind of controlled fury that Silas recognized, because it was the same fury he had learned to control over 40 decades of being underestimated. It hadn't mattered. "We've decided to go in a different direction," Pierce had said, not even bothering to wait until Jonah had left the room. "Your qualifications are excellent, but we're looking for candidates who are a better fit with our team dynamic. I'm sure you'll find something more suitable elsewhere." Jonah had walked out of the interview room. He had walked past the mailroom. He had seen his grandfather standing there, sorting envelopes, his back bent, his hand steady, and something in Jonah's expression had cracked. Silas had seen it. He had seen his grandson's face, and he had understood immediately what had happened. The weariness in Jonah's eyes was not shock. It was the exhaustion of a young man who had been told his entire life that he was not quite enough, not quite right, not quite what they were looking for. A young man who had been told that his excellence was irrelevant because of something he could never change. Silas had made a decision.
The next morning, Pierce Langford arrived at the office to find Silas Thorne standing by his desk. The elderly man was not pushing his mail cart. He was not carrying coffee. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. For a moment, just a moment, Pierce felt something cold move through his chest, something that felt almost like unease. "What are you doing in here?" Pierce demanded, recovering quickly. "You don't have authorization to be in my office without—" "I've been terminated," Silas said quietly. "Effective immediately. Security will escort me out in 10 minutes. Pierce blinked. He had not authorized any termination. But he recovered quickly, as bullies always do. "Well, I can't say I'm surprised. Your performance has been substandard. Honestly, I'm amazed you lasted this long." "My performance," Silas repeated, and there was something in his voice now, a depth, a weight that Pierce had never heard before. "Yes, let's talk about performance." He reached into the pocket of his second-hand cardigan and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He placed it on Pierce's desk. "What's this?" "A list," Silas said, "of every incident I've witnessed in the past 6 weeks, every qualified candidate rejected for cultural fit, every employee of color passed over for promotion, every comment you've made about demographic concerns and presentation standards. 37 incidents in total. 37 moments where you used your position as HR director to maintain a system of exclusion that violates not only the company's stated values, but several federal statutes." Pierce's face went very still. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a mottled paleness like curdled milk. "You don't know what you're talking about," Pierce said. "You're a disgruntled intern, a bitter old man who couldn't hack it. No one is going to believe." Silas reached into his other pocket and withdrew a small, unremarkable phone. It was a model at least 5 years old, with a cracked screen and a faded case. He pressed a single button. The phone dialed a number that was not in any company directory, a number that rang exactly once before being answered. "James," Silas said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly measured, perfectly devastating. "I need you to come down to the 43rd floor. Yes, now. Bring the board minutes from the 2019 Ethics Committee meeting. And James, clear your afternoon." He hung up. He looked at Pierce Langford. And then Silas Thorne did something he had not done in 6 weeks of abuse, 6 weeks of humiliation, 6 weeks of being treated as less than human. He smiled. "Who the hell was that?" Pierce demanded. "Who is James?" Silas didn't answer. He simply walked to the window, looked out at the San Francisco skyline, a skyline he had helped shape, a skyline that existed in part because of the empire he had built, and waited. The door burst open 4 minutes later.
James Aldridge, CEO of Apex Strategic Holdings, was not a man who ran. He was 63 years old, carried himself with the deliberate gravity of someone who had spent 3 decades in corner offices and had not been seen moving faster than a dignified walk since his college track days ended in 1982. He ran now. He burst through the glass doors of the 43rd floor with his tie askew, his breathing ragged, and an expression on his face that the employees of Apex had never seen before. It was terror, pure, unadulterated corporate terror. "Mr. Thorne," James gasped, crossing the floor in long, desperate strides. "I came as quickly as I could. I didn't know you were in the building. I didn't know you were—" He stopped. He looked at Silas's cardigan, at his worn shoes, at the mail cart still waiting in the hallway. What are you wearing?" The entire floor had gone silent. 23 junior associates, 12 senior analysts, and 4 department heads watched as their CEO stood before the elderly intern with the posture of a man addressing a superior. Pierce Langford watched too, his face a mask of slowly dawning horror. "Hello, James," Silas said. "It's been a while." "Mr. Thorne, please, whatever is happening here, I can explain—" "You can't explain," Silas said, "but I can. I've spent 6 weeks in this office, James, 6 weeks in the mailroom of the company I built, and what I've seen has made me ashamed to have my name on the door." James Aldridge went pale. "The mailroom? You've been working in the mailroom?" "As an unpaid intern under the supervision of Mr. Langford here." Silas gestured toward Pierce, who had backed up against the wall of his office, as if hoping the drywall might swallow him. "He's been very instructive. He's taught me a great deal about how my company treats people who look like me." Pierce Langford's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. "Mr. Thorne," James said, his voice dropping to something almost pleading, "if there have been issues, I assure you we can address them through the proper channels. There's no need for—" "The proper channels." Silas's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade through silk. "The proper channels, James, are the reason I'm standing here in a second-hand cardigan, having been fired from my own company. Pierce Langford is the proper channel. He's been the proper channel for 11 years, and in those 11 years the diversity of this company's leadership has declined by 40%. Qualified candidates of color have been systematically excluded. Junior employees who spoke up were terminated or silenced, and not one person, not one, thought to question whether the proper channels were working." He turned to Pierce. The HR director was trembling now. His earlier confidence evaporated like morning dew in a furnace. "You asked me who James was," Silas said. "Allow me to clarify. This is James Aldridge, the man I hired 14 years ago to run the company I founded 41 years ago. And James reports to the board of directors, which reports to the shareholders, and I—" He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the words build.
I am the majority shareholder. I am the founder. I am the reason this building exists, the reason your job exists, the reason you have spent 11 years terrorizing people who couldn't fight back. And I have been standing in front of you for 6 weeks, Pierce, waiting for you to show me one reason why I shouldn't do what I'm about to do." He reached into his satchel, the brown leather satchel he'd bought at a garage sale for $6, and withdrew a folder. It was thick with documents, incident reports, witness statements, names, dates, a meticulous record of every cruelty, every exclusion, every moment Pierce Langford had used his power to make someone feel small. "You didn't give me one," Silas said, "so here's what's going to happen. You are going to be terminated, effective immediately. You will receive no severance. You will sign a full confession to the ethical violations documented in this folder, or you will face a civil lawsuit that will make your divorce look like a minor inconvenience. And you will leave this building within the hour, because security is already waiting outside."
As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway of Pierce's office. They were the same guards who had been told 6 weeks earlier that the elderly Asian man in the lobby was probably lost and should be directed to the service entrance. Pierce Langford did not move. He stood frozen, his mouth working soundlessly, his eyes darting between Silas, James, the guards, and the crowd of employees who had gathered to watch. His face had gone from pale to gray. His hands were shaking. "You can't," he finally managed. "You can't do this. I have a contract. I have rights. I'll sue for wrongful—" Silas took a step forward. Just one step, but something in the movement made Pierce flinch backward as if struck. "This stopped being about my grandson the moment those other students started speaking," Silas said, his voice carrying through the silent office. "My name got James down here in 4 minutes, but there are people in this building who don't have that name, people who have been suffering under you for years, people who were told they didn't fit, people who were passed over, pushed out, silenced. This isn't just about me, Pierce. This is about every person who ever sat in your office and was made to feel like they didn't belong." He turned to face the gathered employees, the 23 junior associates, the 12 senior analysts, the 4 department heads, the security guards, the janitorial staff who had crept in from the hallway. "How many of you," Silas asked quietly, "how many of you have stories? How many of you have been hurt by this man or by the system he represents? How many of you stayed silent because you thought no one would listen?" Silence. The kind of silence that comes before a dam breaks. Then a young woman in the back of the crowd raised her hand. She was a junior associate, maybe 25, with dark hair and tired eyes. "He told me I wasn't executive material because of my accent," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I was born in New Jersey. This is my voice. He said I should work on my presentation if I wanted to advance." Another hand, an older man in a senior analyst's cubicle. "He's been blocking my promotion for 3 years. He told my manager that clients would have trouble relating to a black man in a client-facing role. My manager told me in confidence because he felt guilty about it." Another hand, and another, and another. The stories poured out, a cascade of quiet suffering finally given voice. A woman who had been told her natural hair was unprofessional. A man who had been asked if he was really qualified, despite having 15 years of experience. An intern who had been called diversity hire as a slur by the very person who was supposed to protect her from harassment. Silas listened to every word. His face was still, but his eyes moved from speaker to speaker, acknowledging each one with a slight nod, a silent promise that they had finally been heard. When the last voice fell silent, he turned back to Pierce Langford. "You see," Silas said, "this was never about one old man in the mailroom. It was about a culture that you built, that you protected, that you thought would protect you.
But cultures can change, Pierce. They can change in a single day. They can change in a single moment. And this is that moment. He nodded to the security guards. Get him out of my building.
3 weeks later, the transformation was complete. It had not been easy. Systems of exclusion, Silas knew, did not unravel simply because one man was removed. They had to be dismantled piece by piece, with the same meticulous patience he had once applied to building the company itself. The first change was structural. James Aldridge, acting on direct instructions from the board, had overseen a complete overhaul of the Human Resources Department. The cultural fit evaluation metric had been eliminated entirely, replaced by a competency-based assessment framework developed in consultation with external diversity and inclusion experts. Hiring decisions were now made by diverse panels rather than individual managers. Promotion data was tracked and reviewed quarterly for evidence of bias. The second change was personal. Silas had insisted on meeting with every employee who had been harmed by the old system, not as the company's founder, but as a fellow human being who understood what it meant to be excluded. He listened to their stories. He apologized for the company's failures. He personally ensured that blocked promotions were reconsidered, that rejected applications were reviewed, that the invisible barriers Pierce Langford had constructed were torn down. The third change was permanent. Silas had established an independent ethics committee with the power to investigate complaints anonymously, bypassing all levels of management. He had funded it with a $20 million endowment from his personal fortune, ensuring that no future budget cut or leadership change could dismantle it. The committee reported directly to the board, and its findings were public. On the morning of the 4th week, Silas Thorne walked through the lobby of Apex Strategic Holdings for the first time, not as an intern, but as himself. He wore the same second-hand cardigan, the same worn shoes, the same brown leather satchel. He did not need the disguise anymore, but he had grown attached to it. It reminded him of where he had come from. It reminded him of what mattered. He found Jonah in the junior associate bullpen, sitting at a desk that had been empty 3 weeks before. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a cup of coffee cooling beside his keyboard. He looked up when Silas approached. "Grandpa," Jonah said. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. "I didn't know you were coming in today." "I wanted to see it," Silas said. "The new Apex." Jonah gestured at the bullpen around him. The room was different now. The faces were different. The energy was different. Where once there had been a careful, curated sameness, the same backgrounds, the same schools, the same narrow definition of what professional looked like, there was now a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful diversity. People who had been told they didn't fit, people who had been pushed to the margins, people who had finally been given the chance they had always deserved. "It's working," Jonah said. "The new hiring guidelines, the ethics committee, all of it. We had a candidate in here yesterday, first-generation college student, worked 3 jobs to get through state school. The old system would have rejected her in the first round. She got the offer." Silas nodded slowly. "Good." "She asked me why I chose Apex," Jonah continued, "after everything that happened, after what they did to me and to you. She wanted to know why I came back." "And what did you tell her?" Jonah looked at his grandfather, at the old man in the second-hand cardigan, the man who built an empire with nothing but patience and principle and an unshakable belief that the world could be better than it was. "I told her that silence allows injustice to continue. I told her that walking away is easier, but staying and fighting is how things change. I told her that my grandfather taught me that." Silas Thorne felt something move in his chest, something warm and deep and fierce. Pride, perhaps, or hope,
or the quiet satisfaction of a man who had spent his life building things and finally, at 68 years old, built something that would outlast him? Good answer, he said.
6 months later, on a gray Tuesday morning, a man in a second-hand cardigan walked through the doors of the Apex Strategic Holdings building for what would be the last time. He did not go to the 47th floor, where his name was still on the door. He did not go to the executive suite, where James Aldridge would have cleared his schedule at a moment's notice. He went instead to the lobby coffee shop, the one that had replaced the overpriced chain with a local vendor, part of the company's new community investment initiative, and ordered a plain black tea. He sat at a small table near the window and watched the employees stream past. They were different now, not just the faces, though those were different too, more colors, more ages, more accents, more stories. It was the way they moved, the way they held themselves. There was less fear in the building now, less looking over shoulders, less quiet desperation. A young woman passed by, laughing at something her colleague had said. She was black, with natural hair and a bright scarf and a confidence in her stride that Silas recognized. She had been one of the first to raise her hand on that day in the office. She had been passed over for promotion 3 times. Now she was a senior associate, on track for a management role, mentoring 2 junior employees who reminded her of herself. She did not notice the elderly man in the corner. She did not know that he was the reason she had finally been seen. And that, Silas thought, was exactly as it should be. He finished his tea. He stood. He walked to the door, past the security guards, who now nodded at him with respect instead of suspicion, past the reception desk, where the visitor badges no longer asked for maiden name and country of origin, past the plaque in the lobby that bore his initials but not his full name, because he had never needed the world to know who he was. He stepped outside into the gray San Francisco morning, and he thought about his father, the dishwasher who had never been allowed through the front door of the hotel where he worked, who had died without ever seeing his son's name on a building, who nevertheless believed, with a faith that defied all evidence, that his children would have a better life than his own. "We did it, Ba," Silas whispered to the fog. "We did it."
A person should never be measured by their clothes or their appearance, by the car they drive or the title on their business card. Worth is not something that can be assessed in a glance or judged in a moment. It is built over a lifetime of choices, choices to be kind when cruelty is easier, to be patient when anger is justified, to stand up for others even when no one is standing up for you. Respect is something every person deserves, not because of what they can do for you, not because of the power they hold, but because they are human, and that humanity is shared. And every time we diminish someone else, we diminish ourselves in the process. And there was one thing more that Silas Thorne understood, one truth that had carried him through 68 years of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. It had taken only one person willing to stand up in front of an injustice, one person willing to look cruelty in the face and say no more, one person who understood that true power is not the ability to destroy, but the choice to protect. A single act of courage, offered without noise, can be enough to begin turning the whole thing around, because in the end, it is not the grand gestures that change the world. It is the quiet decisions, the small refusals, the moments when someone says, "This is wrong," and then does something about it, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it is right. Be that person, in your workplace, in your family, in your life. Be the one who speaks up. Be the one who listens. Be the one who changes things. If this story moved you, if you believe that no one should be judged by their appearance or their background, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it.
Leave a comment below telling us about a time when you or someone you know was underestimated, because every story matters and every voice deserves to be heard. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get future updates like this one.